There are thousands and thousands of video games, but only a few of them manage to push their genre or even the entire industry forward. GoldenEye by Rare and Nintendo was such a game that, when the first-person shooter was released on the Nintendo 64 in August 1997, it changed the world of video games forever. It was almost a miracle that Rare was able to achieve such success with this title. The license was inexpensive, the budget was low, and the development team consisted of 9 absolute newcomers to the industry who had not programmed a single game before. And yet, GoldenEye changed the first-person shooter genre and set new standards. I will shed light on the hurdles that the developers had to overcome in this video. 2001, I love GoldenEye. I played it for countless hours on the Nintendo 64 when I was a kid, and to be honest, this video on my channel is long overdue. So then, I am Andy, you are on Game Worlds, and this is the story of a milestone. This is the story of GoldenEye. And although GoldenEye is probably the most famous James Bond game, it is by no means the first. In the early years, many Bond license adaptations were implemented, with the first adventure actually being released without an official Bond license. The text adventure released in 1982, Shaken but Not Stirred, put ZX Spectrum gamers in the shoes of the famous secret agent, even though names were not allowed to be used. The first official Bond game was simply called James Bond, a year later, and was a multi-platform title from Parker Brothers, available on the Atari, Commodore 64 and ColecoVision. Over the next 7 years, it was succeeded by several other Bond games, all of which were mediocre and were often dismissed as typical licensed products. It wasn't until 1990 that the adventure operation Stealth by Interplay made a name for itself, but it also came without an official license, much like Shaken but Not Stirred. This only happened after the title received a lot of positive feedback and was then re-released with the Bond license. In the beginning, he was Bond thanks to Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and perhaps also David Niven and George Lazenby, a true phenomenon that even made it into children's rooms with a spin-off. In the animated series James Bond Jr., Bond's nephew was on a quest to hunt down criminals, which led to releases on the NES in 1991 and 1992. Of course, these had little to do with the original, but the interesting thing is that the NES version was developed by Eurocom, which would take over the Bond license starting in 2000 and would eventually also lay it to rest. But hey, that's a whole different story. In 1993, the Sega Mega Drive received another relatively average Bond game with James Bond, The Duel. The platformer once again fulfilled the cliches. It was quite okay, not bad, but also not particularly good. Just pure licensed stuff. And since the last Bond film had already been 4 years prior, and the Bond games were at best generic action titles, it turned out that Nintendo acquired the license very cheaply and secured it in 1994. What drove the people at Nintendo to secure a film license for the next big Bond movie is something only Miyamoto and his team know. However, the further course of action after successfully acquiring the license was coordinated with none other than Tim Stamper, one of the founders of the England-based development studio Rare, which gained worldwide fame in 1994 with a graphically and gameplay-rich SNS platformer. Tim's team did not seem particularly enthusiastic, as licensed games at that time had a rather poor reputation. But it was a project he was reluctant to leave unfinished. The Rare boss returned to England with an initial idea to turn the game into a platformer based on the Donkey Kong Country engine, but a young programmer named Martin Hollis had other plans, and here I need to make a cut. It is now necessary to take a closer look at Martin Hollis, as he significantly influenced the game and was to make GoldenEye the game that shaped all of our childhoods. At just 22 years old, Hollis got a job at Rare. In 1993, the company hired him because he had extensive knowledge of the Unix programming language and was tasked with the setup and expansion of the Silicon graphics systems that Rare had recently acquired for a small fortune. Shortly thereafter, Martin Hollis was promoted to the second programmer as he worked alongside Tim Stamper on the arcade version of the fighting game Killer Instinct. His closeness to his boss ultimately led Martin Hollis to get wind of Nintendo's offer for the Bond license in 1994 and informed Tim Stamper that he was indeed interested in the project. However, he set a condition. Martin Hollis wanted to turn the James Bond game into an action title with three-dimensional graphics and develop it for the SNES successor, which was still known at the time as Project Reality. Hollis himself was a big fan of the 1994 release Virtua Cop, or a popular PC game called Doom. Therefore, he created a design document that included initial ideas for the overall game design, weapons, gadgets, and characters. As a result, he was awarded the contract, and on top of that, he was given absolute creative freedom, which in hindsight is a real sensation. An absolute newbie who had only worked for a year at Rare as a programmer got the opportunity to create his own game. With this, Rare hit two birds with one stone. They were able to make a commitment to Nintendo, securing funding, while also having developers who engaged with the new D hardware, which definitely represented an investment in the future. Martin Hollis began the production of the title in January 1995 by bringing the first brilliant minds into his team. Surprisingly, he did not rely on the experienced employees within the company, but instead brought in newcomers to the team, just as he was one himself. With Mark Edmonds and Carl Hilton, two talents joined who had only recently signed a contract with Rare. Edmonds was a trained programmer who was familiar with various systems and programming languages, but had never been involved in game development before. And Hilton was an architect, which led Martin Hollis to entrust him with the task of designing level environments that he believed would fit into a Bond game. Additionally, Brett Jones and Duncan Bodwood joined Hollis. Jones was a character artist, while Bodwood was responsible for level design and was to assist Mark Edmonds with programming. Since Rare did not have the final Ultra 64 hardware at the time, the team started on an Onyx workstation and drew inspiration from the already mentioned Virtua Cop by Sega, which had achieved great success in arcades. Since Hollis and his team were unsure of the technical capabilities of Nintendo's upcoming bit machine, the idea of an on-rail shooter like Virtua Cop came in handy, as it allowed them to have the gameplay firmly in their control. When Bond moved along tracks through environments inspired by the film, they could determine which assets should be displayed on the screen at specific moments without unnecessarily overloading the hardware. And while Hollis and Edmonds were working on the engine, the other three team members visited the film set. Armed with a camera, Bodwood, Jones, and Hilton took photos of everything that came before their lens. The architect Carl Hilton then used the recordings to recreate the various environments as authentically as possible, without taking gameplay considerations into account. Brett Jones, on the other hand, oriented himself towards costumes and other props, some of which come from his own extensive James Bond collection. To create the initial enemy designs before Nintendo released any concrete information, the team had to get creative in their own ways. Also regarding the initial controls of the title, according to their own sources, the developers modified a Sega Saturn controller to control an early prototype of their Bond on-rail shooter. All they knew back then was that the new controller would offer an analog stick, ideal for controlling the crosshair in their Bond game and thus targeting opponents effectively. During the course of the year, Rare received the first prototype of the controller. However, according to the developers, it was strictly confidential, which is why it was delivered in a securely locked box that had two holes. In 2021, one could stick their hands through to try out the controller, as programmer Mark Edmonds recalled in an interview. At the end of the year, Nintendo held its own Shushinkai event in Japan, where some information about the upcoming console was announced. Thus, the Ultra 64 was renamed to Nintendo 64, and the controller was also presented to the public in its final form, including the first playable version of Super Mario 64 and Kirby. Other games, including GoldenEye, were featured in short trailers. Those who look closely will notice that the version of the game shown was still presented as an on-rail shooter. The fluid movements of the secret agent suggest tracks on which one moved, but the material shown was created on the aforementioned Onyx workstation and, therefore, did not run on the presented N hardware. Rare only received this at the beginning of the year 1996, but this didn't really bother anyone, as Nintendo had delayed the console, giving Rare more time to work on the game. And this, despite the film featuring Pierce Brosnan was already released in theaters at the end of 1995. Thus, Nintendo missed the simultaneous release of the game with the film, but to be honest, at the time of the film's release, there wasn't even anything remotely resembling a finished game. The engine was ready, however, nothing else was finished, and what Hollis and Edmonds had programmed in the past 12 months had to be transferred from the workstation to the N hardware at the beginning of '96. At that time, only the character models that Brett Jones had modeled were finished, aside from the level environments. To give the game a higher degree of realism, the team decided to use a modern motion capture technique based on magnetic trackers. Duncan Bodwood, one of the programmers, was then wired up with the magnets and performed dozens of animations, all of which were used for main and secondary characters as well as enemies. Particularly noteworthy were the numerous death animations, which created a groundbreaking level of realism for the time and had not been seen before in the genre. Imitating the entire range of movements realistically proved to be significantly more difficult than what is known from today's motion capture recordings. The suit that Bodwood used at the time was wired all over the body and was also connected to a receiver unit that was firmly mounted on the ceiling. One wrong move and Duncan Bodwood would tear the entire motion capture equipment from the ceiling. And since the budget was tight from the beginning, the team had no opportunity to hire professional actors for the faces of the characters. Of course, the characters known from the film were modeled after their real-life counterparts, but for the countless soldiers, guards, and other NPCs, the developers had to get creative once again. Thus, Brett Jones immortalized everyone from the team in the game, also drawing on other individuals who were nearby at the time. Craftsmen, postal workers, and pizza delivery drivers, they were all immortalized as NPCs in GoldenEye. The most well-known character is undoubtedly Dr. Doak, a character who assists Bond with a side objective and bears the likeness and name of David Doak, who would later join the team. The development team needed a doctor, and Doak was a doctor of biochemistry, so they had some fun and included Dr. Doak as a character in the final game. When the team around Martin Hollis received the final N-Mark hardware in early '96, the developers realized that they could extract more technical capabilities from the game than was possible on the Onyx workstation. This circumstance led them to another idea that would significantly change the game. They made the decision to turn GoldenEye into a true first-person shooter that allowed players to move freely within the levels. Just like it was the case with Doom, a game that the development team enjoyed playing in the network after work. This meant that the entire structure of the game had to be revised. Carl Hilton had to remove countless details and also reduce the textures in the level environments to ensure that the game continued to run smoothly. In early '96, additional team members joined as reinforcement, but they also had little to no experience in programming video games. Martin Hollis brought the biochemist David Doak onto the team, who had recently signed a contract with Rare and was now tasked with assisting in level design and developing the enemy AI. Another programmer, Steve Ellis, joined to support Mark Edmonds in completing the game. And with Graham Norgate, the project team gained a composer who was dedicated to creating sound effects and providing the soundtrack for the game. David Doak then began to transform the level environments created by Carl Hilton into classic game levels by establishing start and end points, placing enemies, and probably most importantly, developing various mission objectives. He drew inspiration from Super Mario 64, as he explained in an interview. The team aimed to create a first-person shooter in the style of Doom, but the gameplay was intended to offer more than just wandering through corridors in search of keycards. Mario 64 was the perfect model with its various stars. David Doak designed various tasks that the player had to complete, such as reaching the end of the level, finding specific items, or even destroying them, often using different Bond gadgets like the famous laser wristwatch. He had to master all of this while intelligent opponents stood in his way, dodging bullets, triggering alarms, or taking cover behind corners and crates. To make GoldenEye accessible to a wider audience, the team opted for different difficulty levels, which included a certain twist. When playing the game on lower difficulty levels, the mission objectives as well as the enemy intelligence were also reduced. This had the positive effect that GoldenEye offered immense replay value. Once a player completed a level on the easiest difficulty, there was a strong motivation to tackle the level again on a harder setting, simply to find out what additional challenges the mission required. This gameplay element was intended to significantly influence the game as well as all Bond successors and the in-house title Perfect Dark, and it was also integrated into Doge's Time Splitters series. Additionally, stealth sections were included to promote the approach of being a secret agent and to enhance the atmosphere in the game. You could sneak past cameras or completely disable them with precise shots. Additionally, enemies could be taken down unseen with a headshot, which did not trigger an alarm and avoided trouble. A small but fine gameplay element that was rarely given attention in a first-person shooter at the time, not only in terms of mission design but also in terms of controls, was inspired by Nintendo's flagship Plumber. In 1996, there was no standard for console first-person shooters, and while adaptations of various PC classics like Doom or Wolfenstein could be awkwardly controlled on the SNES and other consoles with a D-pad, the Nintendo 64 offered the legendary analog stick, which the team wanted to incorporate as a central element in their game. But how quickly did the team decide to set up the controls so that someone who played Super Mario 64 could find their way around? Therefore, the analog stick of the controller was used for the general movement of the 00 agent, which resulted in the rear B button perfectly simulating the weapon trigger and being implemented as such. With the 4C buttons or the digital D-pad, players could look up or down as well as strafe left and right, something that PC gamers were familiar with from their keyboard. By using L and R, a crosshair was displayed, allowing for more precise aiming, while a strong auto-aim feature guaranteed success in the gameplay. Those who found it bothersome could disable the auto-aim in the options. Furthermore, the A button was used to switch weapons and items, while the B button served for reloading or as an action button. And yes, as expected, the controls were a bit difficult to get used to at first. As mentioned, there was no standard in 1996, but the longer you played, the more sense the layout made. Those who wanted to could also try out different layouts and adjust them in the options. The team even implemented a dual-stick control by connecting a second N controller, which sounded crazy at the time, but in retrospect was somewhat ahead of its time. While Carl Hilton and David Doak were working on the level and mission design, while Jones and Duncan Bodwood were working on character design and motion capturing, and Steve Ellis and Mark Edmonds were striving to compress everything into an N module, Martin Hollis oversaw the proceedings as the creative director. Graham Norgate was responsible for the sound and created both the sound effects and the music for the game. However, he was also working on Blastcore at the same time, which led him to ask his colleague Grant Kirkhope for help. Kirkhope, who had also recently joined Rare, had just completed the music for Donkey Kong Band 2 and was now faced with the task of composing half of the soundtrack for GoldenEye. However, MGM had only granted Nintendo the rights to the well-known theme song by Monty Norman, which posed a challenge for both composers. The music was meant to capture the atmosphere of the film but could not include any official melodies and ultimately had to not exceed 700 KB, as the remaining space of the 12 MB cartridge was reserved for the game. Thus, Kirkhope and Norgate divided the work by each composing half of the entire soundtrack. Compounding the difficulties was the fact that they did not see any moving images in the first half of '96 as the team was busy putting the game together on the N. Hollis only provided level descriptions on paper, based on which Norgate and Kirkhope were to compose the music. It was only later that Norgate got to see moving footage when Kirkhope had already been reassigned and was working on a game that would become Banjo-Kazooie. And this circumstance impressed me greatly. I mean, the two of them had to compose the music almost blindly, which is simply incredible when you consider how good the soundtrack ultimately turned out and how perfectly the music pieces fit the individual levels. For me, this just speaks to the incredible abilities of both musicians. But the rest of the team also achieved incredible things. They worked on completely new hardware, ventured into a genre that was often neglected on consoles, and yet had the passion to create a game that did justice to the Bond brand. However, this resulted in 80-hour work weeks becoming the norm. Martin Hollis once stated that he worked non-stop 80 hours a week for the entire 2.5 years it took to complete the game, which I can only tip my hat to. But Rare let them do it. The team was given complete creative freedom and all the time they needed. The parallel release with the film had already gone awry, and when it finally appeared in Japan and the USA at the end of '96, GoldenEye was still not finished. Instead of releasing an unfinished licensed game, I'm looking at you, Superman 64, Nintendo, and the leadership at Rare allowed the team to finish developing GoldenEye in peace, which would take over 8 more months. Throughout the year 1996, the project evolved into a true first-person shooter, which was based on the film adaptation but also included missions and levels that were only briefly mentioned in the movie. The numerous mission objectives and difficulty levels contributed to the replay value. The new controls elevated the gameplay to a new level, and the lifelike animations of both allies and enemies were a previously unseen feature in first-person shooters, at least on consoles. In short, GoldenEye began to attract attention. The team around Martin Hollis used the time given to them to refine the game and incorporate elements that, while not necessary, were intended to enrich the game in the end. Since MGM had assured them of extensive use of the license, they incorporated 2 bonus levels inspired by the Bond classics Moonraker and Live and Let Die. Additionally, the team considered cheats that would continue to contribute to the replay value, as unlocking the cheat codes was tied to how quickly players could complete levels. Unfortunately, the official names of the weapons eventually fell victim to the scissors during the course of development. There were likely various reasons for this, as I could gather from different sources. On one hand, Nintendo wanted to prevent the already brutal first-person shooter of 2001 from featuring real weapons being used against people, and on the other hand, and here lies the crux of the matter, Rare was reportedly not allowed to use the names for licensing reasons, as some of the developers mentioned in interviews. Thus, the weapons all have fantasy names that, while reminiscent of the originals, do not infringe on the naming rights. From Bond's Walter PPK, for example, came the PP, and the Kalashnikov became the Kaus and F Soviets. It gets quite curious with the Klop, the oddly looking machine gun. This was named after Ken Lobb, a former employee at Nintendo of America and Rare's contact person during the development of GoldenEye. Praise often had the team's back around Hollis, supported the idea of turning the Unreal shooter into a standard first-person shooter, and was one of the first to show interest in an additional feature that was emerging within the team. And when Hollis & Co. were not developing GoldenEye, they reportedly enjoyed spending their short free time playing Bomberman, where they engaged in daring 4-player duels on the couch. I think you know what I'm getting at, right? Steve Ellis, one of the programmers, suggested incorporating the multiplayer fun they had in Bomberman into GoldenEye by adding a 4-player multiplayer mode to the game. Initially skeptical, Martin Hollis asked his colleague if he could really pull it off as the release of the game was approaching. Steve Ellis confirmed, and just a few days later he had a preliminary version ready that allowed 2 players to compete against each other in a small enclosed level. The team was excited, and with the help of Carl Hilton, who created additional multiplayer maps, Steve Ellis was finally able to develop a functioning 4-player multiplayer mode in just a few months. They worked unofficially after hours on the bonus edition, as they were unsure whether the management and Nintendo would approve the multiplayer mode. When they presented the multiplayer mode to the people in charge at Rare, exactly that happened. There was a barrage of criticism. The decision-makers at Rare were not particularly convinced that a multiplayer mode, where players could see each other's screen, would work. Steve Ellis's efforts were dismissed as nonsense, but the team held on to the idea. What worked in Bomberman would also work in GoldenEye, they were sure of that. Soon after, a veritable black market emerged at Rare, as David Doe once recounted, because the GoldenEye team distributed ROMs of their game to other internal departments and development teams. Soon the multiplayer mode was being played everywhere during breaks and after work, which was another sign that the mode was likely to be a hit with the end customers. The green light for the implementation into the final product only came from Nintendo itself, which saw the potential in it and recognized the 4-player capabilities of their console in the multiplayer matches. Steve Ellis was allowed to include his baby in the final game. However, MGM was not pleased during the final approval when they discovered that the team had included other Bond characters in the multiplayer mode. In addition to Pierce Brosnan, Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and Timothy Dalton were also selectable. Out of concern that there would be trouble with Sean Connery, as his contract at the time did not allow for his character to be adapted into a video game, MGM prohibited the use of other Bond characters, which led to GoldenEye needing to be revised one last time before its release. At least the Golden Gun, Scaramanga's Colt from the movie The Man with the Golden Gun, was allowed to remain in the game and be part of an incredibly fun multiplayer mode that my friends and I played non-stop back then. In May 1996, during E3, GoldenEye was one of the absolute crowd pullers at the Nintendo booth. Anyone who tried the game needed a bit of practice with the controls and the controller, but once that became second nature, there was no stopping them. The press published one positive preview article after another, and the initial skepticism about the licensed game Usand, which was released 2 years after the film, gave way to absolute enthusiasm. On August 23, 1997, GoldenEye was finally released in Japan after 2.5 years of development and was published in the USA 2 days later. Rare and Nintendo delivered nearly 1 million units to retail, which turned out to be too few as the new Bond adventure was completely sold out within just a few days. The new game from the Hitch meter hit the market like a bomb. Owners practically tore it off the store shelves, partly due to the successful single-player mode with its innovative controls, the motivating mission design, and the groundbreaking realism, but largely also because of the incredibly fun multiplayer mode, which ensured that many gamers kept the game in their collection long after they had completed the campaign in 2001. In the USA, GoldenEye quickly became a campus classic and was played up and down in countless student dorms. On November 7, 1997, it was finally time for Europe, although Nintendo decided against a release in Germany. The reason was the level of violence, which nevertheless led the Federal Review Board for Youth Endangering Media to set a precedent with the game and to index GoldenEye despite it not being released in this country. However, this situation bothered German owners little. Before the indexing, there were enough previews and reviews in German magazines, and even after the indexing, the indexed Bond game or Silver Eye was simply discussed in this country. In short, in Germany, the first-person shooter was imported simply and expensively. Those who could drove across the border to Poland, Austria, or the Netherlands, where the game was available for purchase in stores in 2001. And despite all the prohibitions, or precisely because of them, Rare's Bond shooter became a huge success here as well. Kids, teenagers, and adults were glued to the probably too small screens, battling each other in split-screen multiplayer, which led to many sleepless nights and impressively showcased the power of the N console. I am not even referring to the graphical capabilities, which were definitely not to be underestimated, but GoldenEye was one of the first games to clearly demonstrate the potential of the 4 controller ports. Of course, I also played countless matches against my friends. The sticky mines will forever remain a positive memory for me, or the golden gun, which sent the opponent to the afterlife with just one shot. But I also really enjoyed the single player, simply because it heralded a new era for the genre. Previous first-person shooters like Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein were purely corridor shooters, and GoldenEye skillfully demonstrated how first-person shooters could be on the Nintendo 64. But Rare's Bond shooter simply added another layer with its atmosphere, music, animations, and mission objectives, elevating it a bit more into the Olympus where it would remain until 2002. It was a licensed game that came out of nowhere, developed by absolute newcomers, and showed that with enough passion and time, something outstanding can be created. The multiplayer mode, initially dismissed by Rare, ultimately became the universal selling point of the game and was intended to be used in all future console first-person shooters. With his idea, Steve Ellis has advanced the genre significantly, for which I will be eternally grateful to him. Like probably countless other fans, GoldenEye was to become the 3rd most successful game. Throughout its lifespan, GoldenEye managed to sell over 8 million copies, with only Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 being more successful, which is simply sensational. As for Martin Hollis and his team, they received the due respect within Rare and were immediately entrusted with the next project when they were offered the license for the next Bond game. Unfortunately, the sources differ on this matter. Some report that Hollis and his team decided against a second version of the Morningstar. Other sources, on the other hand, state that the team would have loved to develop a direct sequel, but the Bond license became so expensive due to the success of GoldenEye that it became too costly for Nintendo, and EA snatched up the rights. Electronic Arts commissioned Black Ops Entertainment to create a mediocre third-person shooter that in no way compared to GoldenEye. Martin Hollis and his team, on the other hand, dedicated themselves to a completely new project that was also intended to be a first-person shooter and feature a woman as the main character. In 2000, the game was set to be released as Perfect Dark after going through development hell and also seeing the departure of many GoldenEye developers, including Martin Hollis, Steve Ellis, and David Doak. Hollis left Rare at the end of 1998 during the development period of Perfect Dark USAND. A few months later, he assisted Nintendo as an independent consultant in the development of the GameCube before founding the company Tsunami in 2000 and developing games for the DS and the PSP until 2010. Steve Ellis and David Stoke also left Rare in 1998 and later founded Free Radical Design with some other colleagues. And what GoldenEye had was a significant impact on the industry, and it remains one of the favorite games of many gamers to this day. Electronic Arts and Activision tried to capitalize on the popularity of the game a few years after the release of the original. In 2004, EA released GoldenEye, Rogue Agent, a first-person shooter that had nothing in common with the classic aside from the name and generally fell short compared to other genre peers. In 2010, Activision released the GoldenEye remake developed by Eurocom, followed by graphically enhanced versions for Xbox 360 and PS a year later. However, I would rather describe the game as a reinterpretation, as many aspects have been changed compared to the ARC classic. Eurocom replaced Pierce Brosnan with Daniel Craig, the then-current Bond actor, drastically changed the level design in parts, and added a lot of Call of Duty-inspired action to make the game feel more contemporary. 2001. On top of that, there was well-implemented motion control on the Wii and online multiplayer also on the Wii. I liked Eurocom's GoldenEye, but unfortunately the game didn't receive as good a reception as the N. Pandori. All the more sad is the fact that Rare itself was working on an HD remaster around 2007, which was supposed to be released via Xbox Live Arcade on the Xbox 360. Unfortunately, that never happened, as various discrepancies between the different licensees of the release derailed the plans. Last year, the remaster was leaked online and can be played via emulation on PC or natively on a modded Xbox 360 console. I myself took a closer look at the remaster here on the channel and made a video about it. Feel free to check it out if you're interested. Due to the aforementioned licensing disputes, GoldenEye has not been re-released since 1997, neither on the Wii nor on the Wii U, the Xbox 360, or the Xbox. However, this will soon come to an end, as just recently Nintendo and Microsoft announced that they would be bringing the classic game digitally to the Nintendo Switch online subscription and the Game Pass, which has brought tears of joy to many fans. The Switch version will also be playable online, which I can hardly wait for. On the Xbox consoles, the game will receive a technical facelift with improved frame rate and modern control layout, but it will only be playable in split-screen mode, which I find somewhat paradoxical. But, well, I would have preferred the release of Rare's planned HD remaster, but as they say, you can't have everything. This time, we can consider ourselves lucky in Germany to receive the game on Switch and Xbox, as the indexing was lifted at the end of last year. Thus, there is at least a happy ending for German Bond fans. I, on the other hand, am once again surprised that 25 years have already passed since 2001, when GoldenEye captivated me on the Nintendo 64, and I am fascinated by how drastically the genre has evolved over the last few decades. And when it comes to groundbreaking representatives of the genre, GoldenEye is now somehow forgotten by many, which I find very unfortunate. Games like Half-Life, Doom, or Halo are certainly rightly mentioned when it comes to titles that have advanced the first-person shooter genre, but one must not forget GoldenEye. In 1997 it was groundbreaking and single-handedly made first-person shooters acceptable on consoles. This should not be forgotten. Additionally, the game set standards that are still in place today, which also speaks to the impact of the game. Incredible that Martin Hollis and his 8 colleagues defied the adverse circumstances and developed such a gem when no one really believed in them. It is a prime example of what can happen when capable developers are brought together with enough motivation and love for the craft. Something I find myself missing more often today. But enough raving, that was my retrospective on one of the most important games in the entire video game industry. I would love to hear your story now. Did you also play it with friends in split screen back then? Or did you prefer to go solo in the name of Her Majesty and ensure law and order? Or did you perhaps completely miss it and are looking forward to catching up on the game soon on the Switch or the Xbox? Get typing and tell me about your Bond moments with GoldenEye. And if you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to give it a like. Thanks to everyone who has supported me on Patreon. I await your comments. Until next time, adios, your Andy.